First, I'd like to start out with the astronomy tidbit of the week. And for this week, I chose a topic of what color are stars? So if you look at a pretty picture like Hubble will show you, such as this, you'll see that, gee, they look like there's some reds and some blues. But is this really truly what you see with your eye? And if you could visit those stars, is that the color that they'd really appear? And the answer to both questions, sadly, I guess, is no. With your eye, it's the reasons are a little interesting, but kind of obscure. It turns out that when you look at the night sky, you look at Sirius or Betelgeuse and Rigel. You'll see a little bit of redness in Betelgeuse maybe, and down on the foot of Orion, you'll see that Rigel's blue, and maybe Sirius is kind of blue too. But they aren't very vivid, and the rest of the stars all look pretty much just like little white dots. At least to my eyes, they do. And the reason for that has to do with the mechanism of our eye. As most of you probably know, we have, or are thought to have, two photoreceptor types in our eyes, rods and cones, shown here in this diagram. The reason I throw this diagram in was because it also shows a third kind of photoreceptor called the ganglion cells that were just realized back in the 90s that they were also light sensitive, or at least a couple of percent of them are light sensitive, and they're actually not used for forming images, but they're used for circadian rhythm, your sort of sensing of your night and day. Anyway, that tidbit aside, the rods and the cones, as you also are probably aware, the rods are the receptors that are responsible for intensity, for how bright something is, and they're only black and white. Cones are the color receptors. And because the rods have a simpler job to do, it turns out that nature found a much more sensitive apparatus. And so they're the things that work really well in low light levels. And cones only really work when the light is relatively bright. And that's why dim stars don't really appear to have any color at all. You're just seeing them with your rods. And if they're a little bit brighter, then your cones start to get a little bit of information and you see some color there. But they're still pretty dim. If you look through binoculars and brighten up the stars, then you'll see some more color. But they're still, pale reds and pale blues. And is that really how the stars are? Well, if you could look at the stars, like in this chart here of a variety of star types, from O supergiants on down to little M dwarfs, they do go from bluish through reddish, but they're not very saturated. And I'll explain what I mean about that in a minute. But the radiation from stars principally looks like something called black body radiation. So if you look at this curve of the sunlight, this is what you would see if you took the light of the sun and ran it through a prism, and you'd see the spectrum nicely. And some parts of the spectrum are brighter than other parts of the spectrum. And the height of this curve is showing what the brightness of the various parts of the spectrum are. And as you can see, there's some irregularities here. That's due to the fact that there are so-called spectral lines due to the different substances, different elements that are present in the photosphere of the sun. But overall, it follows this curve shape that any hot body would follow. And the hotter the body, the bluer that curve is. So if you look at this next figure, it shows that blue stars are hotter, and so their whole intensity curve is shifted toward the blue. That is, they're brightest in the blue. Whereas red supergiants don't emit nearly as much light, and also the peak of their curve shows up in the red. But if you notice any of these stars, they're not just emitting light at one color. And this explains, why there are no green stars, for example, and also why all the stars are sort of washed out. And to explain that, I have to go to this final diagram here, of a color diagram that helps explain how colors add together and form what we see with our eye. So along the edge of this diagram, you'll see the spectrally pure colors, and they're actually in wavelengths of nanometers, but that's unimportant. So blue through green, and then to the longer wavelengths through red along this outer curve here. And those are the colors of the rainbow that we see. And any color, any other color, any hue that we see is some combination of those. And as you get in toward the center of that curve, then those are called unsaturated colors. It's what you get if you turn the saturation knob down on an old style TV, or if you do it in Photoshop or something. They become whiter and paler. And if you look on this particular chart, they've superimposed the curve for various black body colors as a function of temperature. So what happens is if you have a star that's 6,000 degrees like the sun, it actually is emitting, contributing colors all around the rainbow, all around the outside of this. But the average color is something in the middle, and a whitish color, a pale white, maybe slightly yellow color. If you have a higher, a higher temperature star, like an O star or B star, it's up 10,000 degrees Kelvin, then they look pale bluish, but they still have colors all over the edges of this color chart, and the average color ends up being something in the middle there, and it's that pale blue. And similarly for cooler stars, you'll see palish orange, and it starts to get the more saturated red colors because it gets toward the edge of the diagram. And so the red supergiants, if you were nearby them, or red dwarfs, really would look quite red. But if you were near Rigel, well, you wouldn't want to be too close because it puts out a lot of ultraviolet and even some X-rays. But if you were nearby, fairly nearby, near enough to see what it looked like, it would be, and if you didn't mind ruining your eyes, it would be a very hot white with just a tinge of blue to it, because it's that area in the center of the curve. And there are no spectral combinations here that could give you a green star. So sadly, they're out. Anyhow, on to the chess. Enough about star colors for this week. So this was the final week of the George O'Rourke Memorial, and I was on board too, because as you recall, Brett Kildall gave me a good thumping last week, and he was on board one. And to have any chance of winning the tournament, Brett had to lose, and well, I won. As it turned out, Brett had an easy win, so winning the tournament was never in the cards, but I could fight for second place. And so that's what the battle was. I played Gary Brassard. He had the white pieces, and he opened with d4. I had given a fair amount of thought to playing Gary this week, and had come up with some ideas that I wanted to try out on the black side of d-pawn opening. But unfortunately, after his bishop to f4, those kind of went out the window. So I was kind of flying on my own here, although, of course, I've had this position before. And in this situation, I like to counterattack immediately in the center with c5 against this, to kind of nip the London system in the bud. And I hoped that he wouldn't support it with c3, pawn takes, giving us a symmetric pawn structure. And he didn't. Instead, he supported with the e-pawn. This allows me to trade off the pawns and get an asymmetric pawn structure. So it might be interesting with the minority of 2 pawns against 3 on the queen side. I might be able to play a minority attack. And there are various ideas that can come about from this kind of setup. I went ahead and decided to fianchetto, which is the kinds of positions that Gary and I always seem to get into. He strengthened along that diagonal. I fianchettoed my bishop. He developed his bishop to d3. I suppose one could quibble that maybe the knight should come out first, the f knight. The problem with putting the bishop on d3 is it's not certain in this setup if you want it there, because it's, looking at this strong pawn formation on the king side, or possibly would be better posted on c5 if that's a possibility, or c4 rather, if that's a possibility, going after the weak spot on f7. But he did develop it to d3. and I went ahead and played d3. Now this, or d6 rather. If you look in the opening databases, most people in this position play d5, and I think the idea there is to, is to grab more of the center to get to take control not only of e4 but also c4, or at least contest c4. But I was comfortable with this setup. He played the knight to f3. That is adding control to this e5 square for him. Now he has it covered 3 times. So I went ahead and castled, and hoping that maybe he would think a bit before castling, because he would worry about my bishop pinning his knight. That was one of the reasons for playing d6 as early as I did, and opening up this diagonal where I could potentially pin his knight. But he castled pretty quickly, and I decided not to pin his knight. Afterward, I kind of wish that I had, because as the game develops, my bishop on c8 here gets to be an awkwardly placed piece, and I would probably be better off trading it for this strong knight that's exerting influence over the e5 square. Instead, I played knight to d7. This takes us out of the opening databases. The more common move, it's not all that common, but it's been played in a handful of games, it was instead knight to c6 on that move. And I think the reason there is that, well, first, a couple reasons. One is that it doesn't lock my bishop in. It also exerts the control over e5 that I want, but puts some pressure on d4 as well. So if I succeed in getting e5 in, then I have pressure on one more attack added to d4. So yeah, I can see the benefits of that, but I played it to d7. And Gary didn't give me a second chance. Well, not that I can do with my knight in the way, but anyhow, I suppose he was not so much concerned as keeping my knight and bishop out of g4 as he was just making a little pocket for, oops, not that pocket, a little pocket for his bishop to go into here at h2 if I attack it with my knight, which is something I considered doing, but I didn't really like the looks of that. So instead, at this point, I had been thinking about playing, as I said earlier, with a minority attack, supporting my b pawn and bringing it up to b5 and b4. But I sort of shifted gears and decided to go after playing in the center, and I was maybe a little too ambitious, because I gave myself, a third defense of the e5 square once, so that if I pushed the pawn, I'd be defended by the pawn, the knight, and the rook. And he only has that square attack 3 times, pawn, bishop, and knight. So the only way to keep me from playing e5 immediately is to play rook e1, which is what he did. And then I got really stubborn about it and played queen c7, adding one more defense to the e5 square. Now, of course, I realize that this bishop, is looking me right in the teeth here, and that there's potentially a sticky pin along that diagonal. But it was the only way I could see of really strengthening the e5 square. The idea of playing the queen out here to a5 temporarily controls or adds some support to the square, but it's it's too easily kicked. My queen becomes a target out on that square. So I did not do that. Instead, I went to c7. And Gary made a good move here, knight to d2, and the b knight to d2. And the reason, it's got a number of things going for it. It's a developing move, so that if my queen should munch this b pawn, come out and munch this b pawn, which I'd been thinking about previously, the rook is no longer undefended in the corner. The rook is free to develop toward the center. The knight is threatening to come to c4. So, for example, if I play queen b6, which had been in the back of my mind for if I abandoned the center idea, that I could come to b6 and attack the b2 pawn. That doesn't work too well, because his knight can respond knight to c4, attacking my queen and defending his pawn at the same time. And as it turns out, putting an attack on e5. So all kinds of good things coming out of that. And last but not least, the final thing about getting this knight to d2 is that it prevents the idea of e5 followed, and the bishop goes away, followed by e4 forking his two pieces, because now he has an extra control over the e4 square. So unfortunately, it shuts all of that down. So good move on Gary's part. I went ahead and played e5 anyhow, and this was probably a little overly aggressive. I couldn't see how I'd lose the pawn, even though I realized I might be putting myself in for some pressure. And that I did, and I think actually Gary could have won the pawn. He retreated the bishop to h2, which is actually a good move. And then the best thing I probably have here is just to go ahead and trade this pawn off, take on d4. And if I do that, then he can trade the rooks and then attack my knight. That's this weak knight on the back rank that's, undefended. And there's various ways to defend it, but one way that makes sense is playing the other knight to f6. And then he's able to take the pawn with his knight. And I've ended up with this weak square, the weak pawn on d6. So, this really didn't look very good to me. I don't think it was very good, but it's probably better than what I did. I went ahead with trying to hold on to that pawn there in the center by playing a6. And the idea was I wanted to get in b5, preventing his knight from coming into c4. So, if I got this move in, then his knight couldn't come here. Unfortunately, I'm through this whole series of moves for about, 6 or 8 moves in the middle game. I seem to be one tempo behind. If I just had one extra move, I could get to assert my goals, but I don't. He has time to play a4, which prevents me from playing b5. I'd simply lose the pawn. And so instead I settled for b6, which at least has the virtue of letting me get my bishop developed to b7 and getting it off the back rank, which is a good idea because I really need to have another defense of this rook here. It's getting to the point where I'd be happy to play pawn takes pawn and settle myself with an isolated d pawn, but I can't do it if there's a chance I'm going to lose my rook on e8. So also, if I have my bishop on b7, then I get some control over this e4 square, and I start to reestablish the idea that I might actually fork his pieces. But I'm a little too slow for that. He's able to take my pawn first. I take back, and as I did this, I realized I was in serious trouble, and the trouble that I saw was that all would come out of knight to c4. And I originally thought that I had some answers to this, but as I got closer to this situation, I realized that I didn't. My plan was to defend e4 again, or e5 rather, by moving my knight away so that the bishop would defend e5. But the knight doesn't have anywhere good to go. Originally, I had thought maybe I could go to d5, but the problem there is that now he could just attack it with a bishop move, suddenly have 2 attacks, go from 0 to 2, and I can't defend it quickly enough, and I can't move it because I lose my rook back behind it. So that's not good. Similarly, if I moved, most of my squares are taken up by my own pieces, but if there is one other free square, which is on h5, and there are a couple of good moves for him here, but one is to play g4, and the best thing I have actually turns out is just to play my knight back and let him win the e-pawn. Because if I'm silly enough to play my knight to f4, this pawn is pinned. And so he just takes the knight off, and I can't take it back, or, whoops, there goes my rook. So that wouldn't be too good. Anyhow, knight to c4 would have posed me some real problems, and I think I would have just had to end up scuttling the e-pawn. Instead, instead of knight to c4, he played knight to e4. And it's understandable. You know, he probably wanted to put his knight in front of that pawn to keep it from moving. But that in this situation, that pawn's not going to move because it's very strongly pinned to my queen. And so a knight on e4 really is not a necessary idea here. I was really happy. You know, when I saw this, it made me all of a sudden start to feel like I could get through this phase of the game without falling behind by a pawn. Gave me time to develop my bishop to b7 and start to think about, you know, actually having some mobility here in the center. He traded off the knight on f6, and that only helps me actually because, you know, I can't take back, in this situation, I can't take back with the knight because I lose the e-pawn. But I can take back with the bishop, and it just gives me another defense of the e-pawn. The bishop's a little weak on f6, but, you know, I just have to watch it carefully and make sure that it doesn't get picked off. And then he played bishop to e4. And I think, you know, his thinking at this point, I would guess, is that he was looking for some trades. But the trades are really going in my favor. And they're helping me to get my awkward pieces up and out of the way. And so, you know, I'm happy to see this. And instead of initiating the trade and activating his pieces, instead I was able to develop my final piece, that rook on a8 to d8, where now I'm threatening, you know, for my move to play knight to c5, attacking the queen and putting a second attack on this bishop. So he has to do something about that. What he chose to do, and it was best, was probably queen to c2, just defending the bishop and getting the queen out of the way. But instead what he chose to do was to trade the bishop off. And again, I was happy to see that. I just went ahead and recaptured. And now I still have the threat of the knight becoming active. And, you know, my queen he's actually given me a free tempo to get my queen removed from this dangerous diagonal. And so now I have my knight, rook, and bishop are all, oops, well, not that way, but, and bishop, there we go, are all defending this e-pawn. He has it attacked 3 times, but it's adequately defended. And if necessary, now I can push it. It's now that my queen's no longer in a pin. So he got off of the d file, which is sensible. But I'm able to just go ahead, now that the bishop has moved, that pawn is now mobile. Now that the bishop moved and my queen has moved, that pawn can be moved. And it's safe on e4. I had to worry about it a little bit because he made, you know, he had 2 choices. He could have played his knight to d4, which is what I sort of expected, or to d2. And I thought d2 would cause him some problems because my response is just to go ahead and defend it with my knight. So now I have 3 defenses. And if he attacked my knight with a pawn, it looked to me like this could get him into trouble. So, you know, what might have happened would be something like I could play the knight into d3, attacking his rook. And if he played the rook up here, hoping to play, you know, knight takes pawn followed by rook takes knight or something like that, now suddenly this c-pawn is pinned. And I could simply play knight takes on b4, and if he takes back, there goes the rook. Right, so that would not have been very good for him. Instead, what I thought he might do would be to play his a rook to d1, which, you know, would be a sensible looking move. And if I came into d3 now, he could just move his rook out of the way. And now I have to worry about knight takes pawn, you know, a little combination winning a pawn by removing the defender of my knight. So, you know, I'd have to play my queen to defend the knight. But if I do that, then his bishop comes in and forks my rook and pawn, and he wins a pawn back that way. And this is dead equal. Okay, anyhow, none of that happened. Instead, he made a blunder here, which just totally decided the game at this point. He overlooked the fact that my knight could come into to d3, and he's losing at least the exchange here. I think that would have been the best way to lose. I mean, the best way to lose material is to go ahead and put up with the loss of the exchange. So to move his bishop somewhere, there are a few choices. One is to h6, for example. But I can trade off my knight for his rook and then centralize my queen and threatening to, to come in with my queen. And if this bishop, if I can trade off the bishop, but threatening to win the knight. So, if he comes forward with the knight, I can come back and offer to trade the bishops. And this actually is, there's the problem here is that, his knight is pinned. So he has to do something about that. So that's in fact, he almost can't win this pawn on e4 because of that pin. Oops. Am I going down the right line here? It looks like, right now, right now he's, because of the pin, if I moved my bishop, that I'd be able to play f5 and win the knight, but he has time just, trade off the bishops and go back and defend the rook. And now it wouldn't make sense to attack the knight because the knight can move. Okay, so anyway, after knight to d3, he didn't move the bishop. Instead, he moved the rook, and that's just, allows me to win a whole piece for a pawn, basically. He goes ahead and wins the pawn on e4, but it's a bishop for a pawn exchange, basically. I trade off the rooks. He took back with the queen. In this position, I thought he'd take with the knight. But of course, the problem with taking with the knight here is that there's a hidden threat here. If that knight moves, queen takes, pawn, checkmate. And so, if I just go ahead and, right now he's threatening to take my bishop with check, so I have to do something about that. But once I move my bishop, now he's got to do something to stop that checkmate threat. So a move like pawn up or something, attacking the knight, could put him in a difficult situation. So it turns out that a better move is to take with the queen, but I wouldn't have wanted to do that because, if it's me playing the white pieces, you're down a whole piece for a pawn. You don't want the queens to go off because will really cut down on your chances of complicating the game. And given the chance to trade queens, I did it immediately. And then have to do something about the bishop. I think an inferior move would have been to play it back to g7, where I get some awkwardness on my back rank. Stockfish likes me at this point to play it to e7, which I considered because, on that square, it's controlling a lot of squares that the knight might want to go to. But instead, I decided to play my king off the back rank and offer my bishop in exchange for his knight. And he went ahead and took me up on it. And that just drags my king into the center of the board, which is where it wants to be in an endgame with so few pieces. And the game ends up being finished in just a few more moves. He started to bring his king toward the center, but I have time now to get to the seventh rank, his second rank, attacking his b pawn. He tied his rook down defending that pawn. Would probably have been better to push it, but he's got some difficulties anyway. And then I played knight d3, and now he's got problems. There are two attacks here, so he can't defend this pawn. All I can do is push it out of harm's way. But I also have two attacks here, so I'm going to win one of those two pawns. And in view of that fact, that I'm going to be a whole piece up and basically be dominating the position, he resigned at that point. So it was kind of a fun game for the guy with the black pieces. After the scare over my e-pawn went away, there was, if he had just played knight to c4 at this point right here, instead of playing knight to e4, which allowed me to hang on to my e-pawn and also trade off some pieces in the center. If he had played knight to c4, he would have won that e-pawn, I suspect, and it would have been really tough for me with the 4 minor pieces that he has active in the center. After this point, then it was just a question of going ahead and getting my pieces developed and pushing things forward. So that phase of the game was pretty easy. As I said, Brett won on the first board. I won here, and with what happened on the lower boards, I ended up getting clear second, which is okay, but of course I want to try to win if possible, and so I got to be ready the next time I'm going to play Brett. So that's it from Roger in my week at the club. So long.